You're this elegant worm, this dressed-up doormat, this technicolor cockroach who refuses to die. I hate you, but I love you. People might finally take me seriously after this. I will immortalize you, Oliver. The real, tragic, heartbreaking, pathetic you. Okay, let's get cracking.
You heard Zach. Let's crack into this character study episode that crosses off at least 2 of the Westies as a killer and leaves us with more questions at the end. As we've got a murder to solve, as I'll be breaking down this 4th season of Only Murders in the Building, episode 3, spoilers ahead. We open with taking a look at the updated murder board, and on this murder board, we have new notes that include a list of people who may hate Charles, which by the way, it was kind of hard to make out those names, so I couldn't really see if there was any familiar names that we've heard of in the past. But we also have a picture of Cookie, who we'll remember was Charles' ex-girlfriend, who also happened to date Zaz, and we have some new information about the killer's abilities. As we see that they say that the killer is strong enough to carry Zaz's body, we know that the sniper is proficient with guns, and of course we know that they unfortunately hate Charles. Now in the basement we see that the FBI has gathered up Zaz's remains and have found the bullet casing in Dudenhoff's place. Now I want to point this out now, and I'll tie it back at the end, but I want you all to remember the opening scene's voiceover by Zach Galifianakis as he's describing what it takes to finding your character and how that can tie into a theory I'll be sharing with you all later in this breakdown. As we see that Detective Williams is trying to help the trio by telling them that the feds do not want her involved, so she's trying to give them some useful information by having her cop moment. Now, it looks like the information I shared with you all in last week's breakdown about Dudenhoff being a professor was true, but interesting moment here that we find out that they are out of town and more or less they're actually out of the country, and he's in Portugal, which we will remember is the same place that last week's bathroom ham was imported from. Now, the trio also learns that Rudy, aka the Christmas All the Time guy, was the only tenant unaccounted for while the rest were playing cards doing Zaz's murder. Now, Detective Williams is in the camp that Charles was the one that was being targeted, but also knows not to get in the way of the trio since this is 3 seasons of doing the same thing, as we see the stars of Hollywood walks into the door from LA. Now, like the previous 2 episodes this season so far, this episode is titled after another film. Now, this is a movie I haven't seen, but I've heard great things about it, and that movie is 2 for the Road. Now, the film tells the story of a married couple who reflect on their 12-year relationship while on a road trip from England to France. Now, on this trip, this couple surveys their founding marriage in the present, and the evolution in their relationship reveals itself through vignettes from 4 previous trips they took along the same route. Now, like I stated, I've never seen the film that this episode is based upon as far as the title goes, but if I were to put on my guessing hat, again, not having had seen it, but just reading the synopsis, the film seems to be a story about reflecting on life and relationships, and if you take that premise and that thematic idea from the film and apply it to this episode, we see our characters doing a similar thing, kind of assessing themselves and their relationships, but also looking at the actors who are playing the trio in the movie. They're trying to get information, which kind of lets Oliver, Mabel, and Charles kind of reflect on themselves and looking at themselves. So I think that might be the correlation. If you've seen the film, let me know what you thought the connection was between the film and what it was about and how it ties into the title of this very episode. As we find out that the A-list actors were recommended by the directors to come to New York to study the trio for the day to better understand their characters' roles. As they find out there's been another murder and they are super excited to be involved, even though we see Mabel doesn't think this is a good idea because she believes it's going to be a distraction.
Williams said the bullet was a Winchester 300 Magnum, developed in the 60s. It remains the most popular cartridge among hunters.
So our killer is a hunter. Little did they know that the hunter was about to become the hunted.
So they believe that the killer may be a hunter, and as far as I know, we haven't met a hunter quite yet in this season, but that's definitely something we should keep an eye out for moving forward. Now, I'll be honest with you all, and I mentioned this in my episode 1 breakdown of one of my fears this season kind of coming true in these first opening scenes involving our A-list movie stars. Now, of course, as I'll talk about, there are some great funny moments from them in this episode, but my thing is, and it really highlights in this first opening scenes with them being involved, is it me or are they trying too hard to fit into the flow of the show and they're playing themselves like a heightened version of themselves just to go for the laughs, but also to kind of annoy our trio, and it's just a little bit too far for me. Again, I'll highlight the moments I like from our A-list actors, but my fear is they're just going to be used throughout the season, again, as comic relief versus pushing the narrative forward. Let me know how you thought about our trio as far as the actors in these opening sequence in the comments below. Now, the group ultimately decides to split up to investigate their lead suspects. We have Mabel and Eva Longoria who are going going to look into Ruby. We have Charles and Eugene who's going to look into Vince. Meanwhile, we have Oliver who wants to take Zach with him so they can spend the day together. As we see, Charles is just smitten by the idea that Eugene is just so interested in playing him. He's also nervous in doing so as they come up with this plan to try to get into Vince's house and also to get the eye patch off of him so they can see if his eye might have a bruise on it from the kickback of the gun. Meanwhile, we have Mabel and Eva Longoria who aren't on the same page as Eva renames Mabel.
What about, Mabel?
As Mabel tells her that she just wants to investigate Ruby alone. We see that Eva takes Mabel's advice and goes to Rudy's house alone, which surprises Mabel. Now, during this investigation, we clearly see that Mabel is tipsy as we see them going about getting information completely differently, but ultimately they witness Rudy stepping away for a while as his ham radio plays the theme song of Perfect Stranger, which comes back at the end of this episode. Now, after snooping around and having no luck in finding any clues, we see Eva Longoria gets impatient and tries to force the truth out of Rudy by destroying his Christmas items and points his Christmas story gun at him as he reveals,
I hate Christmas!
That's right, he hates Christmas, as we learn he only had to keep this Christmas obsession up to keep his fitness online persona going. So as of right now, we find out that Rudy doesn't appear to be the killer, and we also find out that the tinsel isn't really tinsel. Which leads me to this next question: what exactly is this silvery string? Now I want to highlight this shot, pun intended, from the actual trailer this season, which appears to have a shot of the shooter, and it also appears to be a woman. Now I could be completely wrong, but is it me or does their figure kind of resemble Anna, who we met in last week's episode? And you'll also notice that they're dressed up in what appears to be disco attire. So could we maybe get a reveal that whoever this killer is that appears to be a woman came from a disco party and then tried to kill Charles but ended up killing Zaz? Let me know if you guys think the same thing based on this picture and also finding out that that wasn't tinsel. Now following up with Eugene and Charles, who make their way into Vince's house trying to convince him to remove his eye patch by making up some ridiculous story about taking Charles's cousin's special eye drops. As we see, Eugene's and Charles' plan isn't working, which leads them to coming up with this terrible idea, which ends up getting Eugene punched in the nose, as we learn that Vince does indeed have a very bad case of pink eye, and we also learn that he doesn't seem to be the killer as of now. As Vince and Charles realize they have a lot more in common than they initially thought as they hug each other, we see that Eugene comes in handy as he sees a picture showing the Westies, but there's one person's face crossed out. Now, is it me or does this picture seem to look like it could be a woman? And I could be wrong in saying this, but if we zoom in, is that Zaz? Look at this picture. Like, they have gray hair, they have a similar height. We know how tall Jane Lynch is. That looks like that could be her in the picture. And as I'll talk about later in the big theory, what if Zaz was undercover playing to be Dudenoff? Now, meanwhile, we have Oliver and Zach, who are not hitting it off at all, as we see Oliver calls in Howard, who found the pig from last week who escaped. Oliver has Howard monitoring the ham radio while Oliver gives Zach the full Oliver experience. While giving Zach the character experience of a lifetime, we finally learn the tricks behind Oliver's uniqueness and his amazing celebrity stories. As we watch Oliver and Zach seamlessly hitting it off and finally getting along, but as we'll find out, we see Zach's only pretending. Now, Howard eventually discovers some clues from the radio as we find out.
You call signs, the theme song from Perfect Strangers, a lot of weather chatter, a lot. Feels like most of these kooks are just waiting for the apocalypse.
Now, something I wanted to point out, and I mentioned this in my breakdown last week, how I felt like the Westies might end up being revealed to be a part of some type of underground ham selling business. But if you notice in this episode, they said it twice that they believe that maybe the Westies are a part of some apocalyptic cult. Again, whether it's an apocalyptic cult or some underground business, the Westies are definitely up to no good. Now, at this point, Oliver's thinking that he finally won over Zach, but unfortunately, he overhears Zach complaining about him to his agent over the phone. As Howard speaks up and stands up for Oliver by saying how resilient he is regardless of his failures, which ends up leading Zach to needing exactly what he needed to hear to have the motivation to play Oliver. As we end this episode with Mabel taking a page out of Mabel's playbook as she rips the police tape off of Dudenoff's door and decides to be a squatter in hopes to keep an eye on Charles, but also in hopes to run into them as well.
You don't believe Dudenoff's in Portugal?
I'm not convinced.
Well, he's not going to be happy you're here.
I'm counting on it. If he finds out I'm squatting here, he'll have to show his face to kick me out.
Now again, I know that they're calling Dudenoff a man. They also mentioned that he was a man in last week's episode, but I just have a feeling that it's going to be revealed that Dudenoff is actually a woman. As we see Mabel and Oliver start singing the theme song to Perfect Strangers, which actually sparks Oliver to remembering Howard writing it down in his notes, as Mabel also remembers it playing on Rudy's radio. As they ultimately figure out that the code is a frequency channel and they find someone on the other end telling them,
"Hello? You shouldn't be on this frequency.
Who is Dudenoff?
And what's with all the ham?
Do you know who's out to get me?
The last person who came around asking these questions got killed. I tell you, drop this or you'll be next."
Now, was it me or did that person clearly have an accent, but also it also seemed like this person on the other end was a woman, and was this Dudenoff? Now, before giving you all my overall thoughts of this episode, let's get into this week's suspect list. As I'll talk about here in a second, but this episode didn't give us a ton of new clues, but I do want to circle back to how I believe that was Zaz in that photo and sharing a couple theories with you all. First and foremost, again, they keep using man, that Dudenoff is a man, but I have a feeling that maybe Zaz was in disguise as Dudenoff. Again, going back to the opening scene of how Zach Galifianakis was talking about taking over a role. Now applying that to Zaz playing a role that led to her death. Also, listen to this audio clip from last season, which played in the previously on at the beginning of this episode.
Killer was after Ben and not you, Charles.
What?
I've been getting some vibes. And I also have my ham radio. And there's chatter of people wishing it was you.
So yes, Zaz had a ham radio and heard rumors of Charles being targeted. Alright, now stick with me here. What if Zaz wanted to get more evidence about finding out about Charles? We know she's a stunt performer, which gives her access to hair, makeup, and costumes. What if she played Dudenoff, became friends with the Westies, all to kind of find out what's going on with Charles? She found out some damning information from this mysterious person, which ended up leading to her death. And again, just thinking about Dudenoff, who's always out of town, it would make sense that maybe Zaz was a squatter and was, again, impersonating this person, Dudenoff. Now, my other theory is Dudenoff is never home, so Zaz made up some story that she's house sitting for them and became close with the Westies, and this was Zaz being herself, who was actually the one in that photo that we saw in this episode, and they had no idea that she was Charles' stunt double. Now, Zaz was about to tell Charles the sensitive information. Dudenoff came home early, accidentally tried to kill Charles, but killed Zaz, and doing so. Are you guys seeing where I'm going with this? And then lastly, this is a crazy theory, and I just want to point out that I do believe Dudenoff is like an actual person, whether it's a male or a female impersonating a male, whatever the case may be. But my silly, stupid theory, and I just have this feeling that they're going to tie it into like some siblings type of situation. What if Zaz has like a twin out there, or at the very least, someone that looks so identical to her, very similar to how Charles and her can kind of look like each other in different angles? So what if Dudenoff kind of resembles Zaz, and again, she was able to kind of infiltrate the situation because she looks like him or her, and again, things just kind of happen, which end up getting her killed. And I also want to mention that Dudenoff was very aware of that pig. So again, I do think Dudenoff is an actual person that lived in that apartment, but again, who are they and when will they be revealed? And lastly, I'm not putting this individual as the killer, but I feel like there's going to be some big reveal between Zach Galifianakis playing Oliver. The reason I say that is because Detective Williams said earlier in this episode that they better not get them hurt, and the fact that we spent like this personal time away from the murder and everything going on with Mabel and Eva Longoria and Eugene and Charles, and how Oliver and Zach seem to have this like personal connection. Again, I don't think Zach's the killer, but I think there's going to be some type of important thing that's going to happen between their relationship moving forward. Now, wrapping up and giving you all my overall thoughts, I thought this episode wasn't as good as last week to me, and wasn't too worried about giving us more clues, which was understandable. It's episode 3, and they have to obviously stretch this out, and they've done this in previous seasons where this is kind of the rhythm of the show. For example, last week was a meaty episode that gave us a ton of new clues and how that plays into the overall murder, but then this week played for the laughs. It played for more of the comedic beats, and also kind of was more of a character focused episode. Now, by no means I think this was a bad episode. I just didn't think it was as important to the main narrative as last week, but in all honesty, I still had fun with the episode. There was some solid moments of humor, especially I got some good laughs from Eva Longoria, who to me was the MVP of this episode. She was just so damn hilarious. I also had a good time with Zach Galifianakis and Oliver, and their montage was funny. Again, this episode was more focused on giving us less answers and clues on the murder and more of the characters interacting with one another for entertainment purposes, which, like I said, there was some really funny moments, but also I think the purpose purpose of this episode was to also remove Rudy and Vince off the murder board. As I mentioned last week, I still have the feeling that I don't think that any of the Westies were involved in Zaz's murder, but there's definitely something very suspicious about what's going on. Like, again, Rudy taking that call and the ham radio being something collected for whatever their shenanigans are involved in. Now, one more thing I also wanted to mention, which is pretty exciting news, which is they officially announced we're getting to season 5. I believe they made this announcement after only the second episode of the season so early is because they're maybe preparing us for this season to have a cliffhanger, and they don't want the audience to panic and be like, listen, we don't have to wait that long to pick things up, because as we know, this show gets in production really quickly. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're shooting season 5 like by the end of this year, which, speaking of season 5, they didn't say that season 5 was the last season of the show, which brings me to this question. How many more seasons of Only Murders in the Building do you all think we'll get before it gets too repetitive? Now, that's going to be the end of this week's breakdown of Only Murders in the Building Season 4. This is now your turn to let me know your thoughts on this episode, favorite moments, least favorite moments, any deeper meanings, Easter eggs, clues that you all took away from this episode. And of course, share your theories of who you think was in that photo, who was crossed out, but also who's the mysterious person that was on the other end of the radio. Now, if you made it to this point in the video, I really appreciate the support. Do me a favor, put in the comments right now, #PerfectStranger. Now, I'll be back next week to discuss episode 4. Now, if you appreciate these breakdowns, do me a favor, hit the like button, share this video to anyone and everyone you know that loves this show. And also, if you're not subscribed, consider sticking around by subscribing and hitting that bell notification. You all are amazing, stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next video.